year of events focused on protection, conservation, and management of World Heritage. We want to uncover untold stories to broaden our views on heritage practices and future perspectives. Knowledge gathered this year will be published in 2022 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Convention. The Our World Heritage Initiative is created by individuals working on 100% voluntary capacity. We would like to point out that Our World Heritage provides an open dialogue platform that is based on voluntary work of session organizers and speakers. Our World Heritage welcomes diverse viewpoints in the spirit of collegial debate where mutual respect is afforded to all. Please note that the expressed views do not necessarily reflect the official position of Our World Heritage. We thank today's speakers for telling their stories, and we thank you, the listeners, for your kind interest and questions. If you want to remain up to date on our activities, you can follow our social media. We maintain channels in multiple languages to break through the language barriers and connect to local communities. You will find all links on our website, ourworldheritage.org. Thank you for being with us today, and we wish you a very fruitful event.
Good day, everybody, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for joining us in this session about decolonizing heritage, which I think is one of the most important sessions of this Our World Heritage Initiative. One of the big challenges with World Heritage has always been that it is rooted in this convention that was designed and drafted in the 1970s, when people viewed heritage and viewed other people around the world in a very different way. And I think one of the real challenges has always been how to make this World Heritage Convention more inclusive and how to make it more relevant globally. Many of the challenges that exist at World Heritage sites are probably related in some way or another to the way that people get involved, the way that people engage with those sites, and the way that people are brought into that discourse about World Heritage and World Heritage sites generally. I don't want to take up too much time. We have three, I think, really interesting speakers, and three speakers from very diverse backgrounds, have different perspectives on World Heritage and heritage generally. And I think these are really exciting perspectives from Suraj Rasool from South Africa, Robert Bartesius from the Netherlands, and Pascal Taravinga from Zimbabwe originally, and now working in South Africa as well. I see he's trying to connect to audio, but I hope he will join us in a minute. I was looking at ways to introduce all of these speakers and thinking about the first time that I met all of them. And oddly enough, it turned out that all of those first meetings were very, very uncomfortable and slightly embarrassing. But I'll get to that in a second. But as I say, I do want to jump straight in and let the speakers present their perspectives, and then hopefully we can have some discussion afterwards. As I said, this is, I think, one of the most important topics of this entire initiative, and it's great to have the three of them here. I want to first introduce Suraj Rasool. He's a professor of history at the University of the Western Cape and directs the African program in Museum and Heritage Studies there. He's also an associate member of the Global South Studies Center at the University of Cologne, and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Lushan Collection in Berlin. In South Africa, he served on multiple boards of national heritage institutions, including heritage management institutions and museums as well. His publications have included some of the key issues relates to the politics of heritage and the ways in which heritage is accessed and how it's been transformed in both heritage management and in museums. I remember the first time I met Professor Rasul was at a mutual friend's party, and I knew him by reputation and had been a fan of his perspectives, and struck up or tried to strike up a conversation with him, and he was really patient with me as I kind of awkwardly muttered some nonsense about underwater cultural heritage. And I think he was tremendously relieved when somebody else joined the conversation and it moved in a different direction. But that interaction left a lasting impression on me. Fortunately, not on him. First impressions hopefully don't last, otherwise he wouldn't be here today. But yeah, I want to hand over immediately to Professor Rasul, and I'll speak to you later on.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I can assure you I have been an admirer of your work, initially in underwater heritage and more generally thereafter. And you are certainly one of the interesting and important scholars whose work I follow. This is a very busy area right now, especially in the one branch of heritage that addresses museums. Museums are changing at a pace like never before, or at least ideas about museums. The question of restitution and what restitution means is on the agenda in so many societies, not just about iconic collections like Benin bronzes, but more generally. But I thought I would start by just revisiting some important definitions and some important debates that lie behind some of the issues that we need to get into. And that is, firstly, the distinction in understanding heritage as somehow an inheritance from the past versus an approach which understands heritage as something that is produced in the present and belongs to the politics of the present. Secondly, a debate that certainly has been important for many of us in my department and in different universities in South Africa, especially as history seemed to be the discipline through which you made a new nation, and especially in the post-apartheid era. A debate emerged about the distinction between what we call history and what we call heritage. And unfortunately, with many people having a very limited understanding of heritage as something that they derided and frowned upon as something that had to do with commerce, the sale of ideas of pasts and societies, or something that involved state control. Thirdly, there's a very important debate and set of questions that emerged that counterposed tangible heritage with intangible heritage, that urged us to move away from approaches that emphasized what one former councillor of the South African Heritage Resources Agency called the edifice complex, and essentially the dominance of the architectural in the attachment of value to sites. But at the same time, the notions of the intangible may have been another means of reproducing the ethnographic, a kind of museum and heritage category that many people on the African continent have had a tremendous discomfort with the ethnographic seen as something that was part of the colonial project and part of the colonial administration of people, of the relationship between people and objects. And in some ways, adding to dispossession, if you like. You can have your practices, we will have your artifacts. But at the end of the day, as many scholars have insisted upon, if we think of heritage as the values, as the meanings that attach themselves to sites and practices and collections, all heritage is in many ways intangible. There is another very interesting distinction that we need to think about that I encountered when I spent some years teaching heritage questions in Latin America. The distinction between our Anglophone notion of inheritance and a Lusophone, Francophone, Hispanophone concept of patrimonio or patrimoine as one that really emphasizes property rather than inheritance. And this comes out in our Afrikaans Nederlands concept of erfenis, which also is attached to the way in which we define land as property, as erf or as earth, as we would say in English. And then there's another important question, and that is heritage which seeks to impose a means of governance or governmentality and a sense of order, and bringing a sense of order versus a much more productive understanding of heritage and an approach to heritage which can be understood and which emerges as a domain of mobilization and of what many people call critical citizenship rather than the orderly citizenship expected as part of heritage as governance and order. So if heritage involves the care for collections, sites, practices that involve heritage disciplines, that involve relations of expertise, what you're really talking about and are needing to question is this kind of ideology or discourse of care that presents itself as kind of preservation or preservationism, and through this idea of conservation for future generations. So, of course, as I've said initially, some of the greatest strides recently are being made in that arena of heritage that we think of as the museum, that is rethinking the authority of collecting institutions in relation to those collections, that are identifying, that are thinking about the violence that was involved in collections, that are admitting to histories of looting, that are realizing that museums were not just beneficiaries of colonial violence, but were indeed embedded in expeditions of conquest. And that museums in many ways are being rethought. There is the very important idea that has emerged that restitution is going to give rise to a new methodology of museum making, that restitution is not just a set of events of handover from one government to another, but precisely what it means is going to determine the museum of the future. And already we have wonderful examples from District 6 Museum, great museums in Latin America, in Brazil, such as Museu da Maré, and other museum projects that Museu da Amazônia, for example, that show that museum can be something other than just an institution that cares for collections. That the museums can be means of social mobilization, and that museums are projects and processes. So indeed, one of the important things that we are realizing in these new debates about care, about objects, about restitution is the extent to which our conventional professional standards generating bodies such as ICOM, ICOMOS, and the instruments and conventions against illicit traffic and so forth have failed in their ability to address questions of colonial violence, looting and extraction, and colonial patterns of collecting in an international division of labor. So what I want to discuss now is something that I think is something that I've been worrying about the most recently. And it goes back to my work that I did many, many years ago in the first years of existence of the South African Heritage Resources Agency as a member of its council, as we came to grips with what heritage resources management was. And it's obviously a domain of the government of sites and the operation of heritage disciplines, such as architecture, archaeology, and I'm particularly interested in the operation of contract archaeology, in which the conventional techniques of identification, description of value, grading, conservation management plans, declarations occur. These are the kinds of rituals of heritage resources management, ostensibly as protection when there is a threat, but also which seek to bring prestige. Ironically, sometimes, as many scholars have pointed out in many examples of the operation of world heritage, leading to forms of dispossession. So the question for me is how this kind of approach to heritage, especially its contract archaeology version, has been tied to ideas of development, of infrastructure, of buildings, of intervening in and even destroying landscapes, with heritage understood as a means of mitigation. This is the approach, heritage as mitigation, of rescue, and not a means of presenting value that would indeed prevent development. Heritage is indeed embedded in this discourse of development of what is essentially capitalist relations of land, in which heritage is supposed to bring some form of balance, but where destructive activity is deliberate in the name of development. And what is part of the problem here is that land is understood as property and not as landscape. This is the problem that arose in the case in our struggles, heritage struggles in Cape Town at District 6, where the District 6 Museum presented the idea of declaration of District 6 as a national heritage site, as a means of protecting the values of District 6 from inappropriate forms of development on a landscape of forced removal, on a wounded landscape. And the approach of the South African Heritage Resources Agency was to say that it is unclear what the map of District 6 is, and it cannot thus be declared. This was also the problem that was faced at Prestwich Place, one of the biggest failures of heritage resources management in South Africa. A famous case in which the dead of the remains of enslaved people lying in their graves was not sufficient to prevent development. What was arrived at was mitigation and the creation of an ossuary, which would allow for future access to those remains by human biologists. We have an ongoing struggle right as we speak in Cape Town on the landscape of the mountain, down at two rivers on the banks of the Lisbeth River, where we have a projected development of an office park, urban complex of apartments in which Amazon will be the lead tenant, and where the indigenous people have been offered a cultural center as a means of mitigation, and another group of indigenous people have entered into battle with the idea of protecting this landscape of dispossession because of its heritage value. And unfortunately, this approach to mitigation will reproduce the patterns of dispossession in the name of development. So we had a recent example in the last few years where the South African Heritage Resources Agency was able to intervene and make a grading and a declaration in order to prevent commercial style development in Bo-Kaap. But this was not the same. This was not a recognition of the Bo-Kaap as a historic landscape. This was done through a heritage overlay and the protection of architecture. And so that is not an adequate example to present as heritage transformation. I think the main point that I want to make is that our concepts of heritage, notwithstanding all our efforts at transformation, have continued to privilege the older heritage disciplines and have not been able to address complex historical landscapes as a means of enhancing participation by the people. The only way in which our heritage resources management in South Africa has been able to deal with history is through kind of antiquarianism or through the bolstering of the biographic order, in which only sites attached to political leaders are deemed to be significant, such as all the sites attached to Nelson Mandela's biography. I remember even needing to apply my mind to the declaration of the cutlery used in prison by Nelson Mandela. So what we are talking about now is finding a practice of heritage as a radical practice that would address histories of dispossession, of enhancing participation, of rethinking expertise, and of going beyond heritage as mitigation. Heritage as mitigation in a society like South Africa reinforces histories of dispossession, colonization, and racial privilege. And what we need to do in the final analysis, to use a concept that is being worked with by one of my doctoral students, Talia Lubinsky, in her research, is to open up post-preservationist approaches to heritage practice. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. There's a lot that I would like to talk about related to what you've just explored, and I'll maybe leave that to the end. There are a couple of things that really stood out, and ideas that I really like. This idea of museums as processes, that they're not these fixed institutions that we tend to think of them as. And I started to wonder about the way that we look at heritage and the way that we do heritage is kind of this self-perpetuating cycle. We're all, well, many of us are educated within the frameworks of Western disciplines or disciplines that were developed in European universities, archaeology, heritage management. And that's how we understand heritage. That's how we understand the past. That's how we understand the present and how we manage those things. And in many of the conversations, especially around things like underwater cultural heritage and tangible heritage, there's this fear of decolonization. There's a fear of thinking about heritage differently to what everybody's used to. And I'm not sure why that is. It may be a reaction to, as you mentioned, those ideas around restitution, and maybe people are unwilling to give up those objects and practices and things that they've accumulated from around the world and put into these institutions that they believe are the right way to manage and protect and provide access to those objects. So I think this idea of museums as a process and that changing way that people access and engage with heritage through those museums is a really interesting concept. But we can discuss that, I think, later on. And I'm sure we'll get some questions from the attendees as well. Robert Partasius is next up, and he's a professor of heritage studies at New York University in Abu Dhabi, and in the faculty of archaeology at Leiden University in the Netherlands. A bit difficult to sum up Robert briefly because I've known him for a long time and have an extensive knowledge of his CV. But he started out as a curator at the Amsterdam Museum and a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, which allowed him to explore various places around the world in Asia, Europe, and Australia, first of all, and then expanding into Africa and the Americas. And I'm sure he'll talk about his experiences there. But this kind of expansion into the rest of the world has allowed him to increasingly focus on World Heritage sites and the ideas of World Heritage, and his work at places like Zanzibar, Mozambique Island, Robben Island, all in Africa, and Galle in Sri Lanka, has allowed him to look at those changing perspectives of heritage and heritage narratives, and how people are included in heritage management and access to sites. My first meeting with Professor Partasius was he was asked to come out to South Africa to assist the South African Heritage Resources Agency develop a proposal for a development program in maritime archaeology and underwater cultural heritage. And I remember we were sitting in the boardroom and we discussed all of the issues and how we would look at getting funding for that program, and a little bit about what I wanted to do in the future. And I talked about my ambitions to do a PhD at the time, and the possibilities of doing it through a Dutch university. We got to the end of the conversation. I packed all my stuff into my computer bag and forgot to zip it up, stood up, and everything fell out all over the floor. And I remember him looking at me saying, so you want to do a PhD, huh? It worked out okay. He was my supervisor for my PhD, and we've done quite a lot of work together since then. So let me hand over to Robert, and again, I will speak to you afterwards.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Siraj. The problem with all those first impressions is that we all have become friends and well known to each other. And I think one of the big mangoes of this session is that we probably all agree. I was just, while I was listening to Siraj and the points that he raised, there are a few points that really stood out to me, as you already mentioned, the museum as a process, and what I find very, very interesting, the mitigation, heritage as a mitigation, and I would like to think a little bit more about that. But my point, first of all, thanking the organizers of this session to invite us for such an important topic, because I think for most of us involved in heritage on whatever level, power structure is one of the most important issues to address. And Siraj already said, heritage is most of the time still seen from the preservist, the conservationist background. And okay, it's all fine to talk about the past and to see what kind of perspective, but we need to take care of those traces from the past. And I think that is really the main problem, as he also pointed out, that the let's say the classical disciplines as history and archaeology are actually dictating how we look at heritage, because that are the traces that we preserve. No webinar is complete without a cat. She was so good the whole day, and now she walked into my. So this is sorry about that for all the audience. No, stop. Don't. No, please go outside. So to pick up the problem with the power structures is that it is actually dictated how we should take care of our past. And as already said, that the other side of heritage is how we create that vision on the past, or how it is actually created in the present. And I think that is where the biggest conflict is, also addressing the issues of the World Heritage Convention, because as Jonathan pointed out in his introduction, it was written up in the 1970s. It had a very long history already. That whole concept of global heritage has a much more longer history. If you know, let's not go too far away to the world wonders, but if you look at the imperialistic period, most of the problems that we're dealing with now are shaped up there when the idea of a universal culture, a global culture that was dictated by Europe, you know, they were looking actually for their traces, their connection with the world culture. Couldn't believe that the people that were living around those big monuments from long time ago were actually the people that owned that culture. So I think most of those problems comes from there. And what I actually want to address is, I think I am from the three presenters, I should be able to present the European vision. You know, I was trained in Europe. So let's take on that role a little bit and share my experience as being trained in Europe from this very Western perspective that seems to be a problem. And talk you through the development that I have gone through, and being now one of the people that really believe that we should stop looking at heritage as a thing, but looking heritage as a process. And actually, to start talking about decolonization, I think we need to also look at decolonization of heritage from the same perspective as a process. You know, it's a very fashionable word. Everybody's using it, so the risk is big that it becomes an empty word. Like, you know, for many of us, post-colonialism is still a very important discipline within, you know, both history, anthropology, in the thinking. But for a lot of people, it has become a kind of, you know, a household word to that means nothing anymore. You know, nowadays with my students, the word meta, you know, it doesn't mean anything to me anymore, but everybody is using it. So with decolonization, I think it's one of the most important topics to address right now. We should give it the value that it deserves. And to me, when I, you know, thought up the title of this talk about replacing pepper for ginger, it has to do with those power structures. The quote that I used was actually a quote that I got from a Sri Lankan colleague 30 years ago. And basically, we were not discussing power structures of heritage. We were talking about the remains of the colonizers. And, you know, since I came from the Netherlands, was funded from the Netherlands, most of the focus were Dutch remains, and what we called then already mutual cultural heritage. And my Sri Lankan colleagues said, well, you know, it was for us, it was replacing pepper by ginger. It was spicy for us. It doesn't know, it stayed colonizers. So that idea of that, the connection between colonizers and the remains of the colonizer needs to be decolonized didn't work for me. It is, of course, the most in-your-face perspective of the most in-your-face remains that you can see. This is the connection with the past. But what those remains mean is something else. And I think if you talk about decolonization, it means different things for different people, like heritage means different things for different people. And I hope that we can, like with the heritage, we can make it a process that is flexible, that can be adjusted, that can be reassessed, rethought, instead of just saying, okay, let's decolonize now. You know, at my university, in the discussion about Black Lives Matter, I'm working partly for an American university. You can imagine how big that topic has become the last 2 years. And then you see people like me, white people, middle-aged, thinking, yes, I understand now. Let's start. And I didn't say that, luckily, but colleagues of mine said, okay, let's start, I'm with you. And then my Black colleagues saying, let's start. You have no idea how many decades we already fighting. You know, you say, let's start. And I feel that it is the same with the decolonization of heritage now. Some people say, okay, yes, we understand. Let's start. You know, finally we see what you mean, and let's start. And that is, for me, that's a good start, but it's the wrong approach if you want to have something that lasts longer. Just to give an example, when I started, the word heritage didn't mean anything to me. When I started 35 years ago, I was an historian, archaeologist. We actually felt like, you know, heritage is for people with tweed jackets on, pipe in their mouth, and taking care of their castle, like Girard said, the ownership of the past. And for us, it was all about understanding the social economic background of, in my case, the European expansion. Got to work in all kind of former colonies, or at least where the Netherlands had a connection with. And I came into underwater cultural heritage. I came into underwater archaeology. And by finding shipwrecks that nobody knew were there, we actually got into the process of creating heritage. Nobody knew that that shipwreck was there. And by funding an excavation, by funding a museum that would house those excavations, and then thought, okay, our collaboration is great. Let's restore the Dutch Reformed Church. Nothing wrong with that. It's all about, you know, understanding the past. And that was slowly the realization at my end that, you know, that it is something like heritage creation, that it is not just, it's there and we have to take care of it. It is there because we start to bring that narrative in. All of a sudden, the Dutch layer of goal in Sri Lanka, the World Heritage Goal, became much more important, not because that layer was more important, but it was important because Dutch scholars, Dutch practitioners, Dutch money made that much more prominent. And worked on that basis of training local teams. You thought, okay, I'm contributing to what we called capacity building, and so that they can take care of the choices they will make in preserving their traces. Yeah, we trained them in stained glass restoration, for instance. You know, there are only two churches in Sri Lanka with stained glass. So, you know, the stupidity was still there, but the process of thinking started to develop. And actually, for me, and I promise to give you a little bit of the perspective of, you know, when you saw what was happening. I think my arriving with Jonathan in South Africa and a project that we were doing in Afghanistan were, for me, the absolutely eye-openers. Landing in South Africa, and I'm sure Pascal will touch further on that perspective, but landing with the government agreement that the Netherlands would help with capacity building in maritime archaeology and maritime heritage management. You know, we had a good example of 10 years in Sri Lanka, really great success. Then you land in Cape Town, and the then CEO of Sarah, Sibongile Mazugu, she looked at me, said, well, how wide do you want to have your topic? You know, do you really think that we are interested in your shipwrecks? And I said, luckily I met Jonathan, and luckily I met a lot of other people, and luckily I became good friends with a lot of people in South Africa that taught me that other perspective, that process that I was in, like, okay, there's nothing wrong with preserving the past, but you don't realize that you actually keep intact the power structure of what is important. What is important is a shipwreck is important, or is the story around the shipwreck important? And Jonathan, I hope you touch on it at the end of this session with, you know, what led you to do different kind of projects that were still maritime archaeology, but actually digging up the narrative of the local communities rather than digging up the shipwrecks. For me, the same thing happened in Afghanistan, where again, with Dutch funding, in 2003, Afghanistan was liberated of the Taliban, and the whole world was there to assist Afghanistan in rebuilding itself. And one of the focus there was to rebuild communities through culture. And since I was at that stage, I was such a successful project leader in many countries to address this. They asked me to help the National Museum in Kabul. And basically, when we arrived there, the director of the National Museum in Kabul said, well, of course, welcome, we can help, you can use all the help. But, you know, he told me at that stage that it was kind of the whole world is going to help. What would really make a difference is if you could help us to spread out over the whole Afghanistan, not just for the you know, the eye catchers, like this is an you know, prestigious project in Kabul, but go out there in communities and help them. His vision was to build unity in Afghanistan, which is not a unified country. There's so many tribes, so but at least to give a kind of a context for them and to give pride to those tribes by offering them a local museum. Well, Shiraz touched on it. The whole concept of museum is a very European-centered idea. So when we arrived in the north of Afghanistan, in Kulm, and with the local team, and they asked the local community, you know, we have a building, it's an old palace, you can put your own museum together with the culture that you represent. They started to talk, and they started talking for a whole year, and then the plan came out to first do the gardens around the palace. So imagine it was a beautiful palace, you know, built in the 18th century by the local rulers, then took by the Soviet, then took by the Taliban, and now the community could have it. Instead of having a plan for the museum, for the building itself, they actually said, if we want to restore our heritage, if we want to have an heritage element that really serves us, then we should restore the gardens. And we, of course, didn't understand, because landscaping is something you do at the end. And then luckily they were able to explain that they were never having access to that palace. In the power structure of culture, they would never have access to that palace, but they would have access to the garden. They had access to the garden, and actually to restore that community sense and to invite visitors, they restored the garden. And so happened. So for me, at that moment, I understand both through South Africa and through Afghanistan that an open definition of what heritage means for communities is the starting point, not to throw everything away, but to create space for people to identify their connection with the past, and actually to produce that heritage from the present and how it serves them at that moment. Do I still have a minute, Jonathan, to explain about another site?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, with that idea of open definition, we had a wonderful project with Robben Island, because they were struggling with UNESCO and their you know, the ICOMOS committees that went to visit them and say, oh no, this is all badly managed. And by just having that a project of open definition with students from all over the world, we learned a lot about how you can approach heritage in a different way. At the same time, I landed in Zanzibar with students from NYU at that stage, and we learned what it means if you don't have a say in World Heritage. What happened on Zanzibar was that it became a very Stone Town became a very popular World Heritage site. And the local population community were losing more and more of their sites that they could use for, you know, hanging, drying their wash, playing with their kids. And it was a beautiful spot at the beach where they had swimming lessons, where the women hang out. At night, there was a kind of a party center that you know, was a bit of obscure place, but clearly a place that was used by the local community as the space for, you know, to hang out and use for their cultural events. Then the Hyatt came along because of the importance of the World Heritage Site and the economic side of it. They got permission to build their hotel on that site. So that lost the public space that the local community was losing out on, became more and more problematic. And they fought it. They tried to make, you know, their voice heard, which failed, of course, because Hyatt is much more important than drying your wash and having swimming lessons. And then they realized, and that's another example of, you know, that process of reclaiming space. They said, okay, if we're not able to reclaim the space ourselves, then at least we should record our memory and actually make our memory the intangible side of how we experience this space and how we deal with our heritage. And I think that was one of the most, you know, it was completely out of their own midst. It had nothing to do with international interference, of capacity building, of forcing people to, you know, to speak up. That was really one of those initiatives that I thought, okay, if we really want to decolonize the fictional heritage and get rid of that Eurocentric idea of that you preserve the past and then you give it a narrative, then we should create that space. And their organization is called Women Reclaim Space on World Heritage. And I think that is one of the assignments that we have. We have to be careful now that the Western perspective says, okay, we got it, let's decolonize. They have no idea still what to do. So what needs to be leading, instead of replacing pepper for ginger and go on the way we always went on, we really have to make this a process in which we create more and more space, and give, by open definition, not just say, okay, those monumental remains are whatever it takes, we should preserve them, because yeah, they are there and we have to take care of it. I don't know. I heard when I was in South Africa, people saying maybe we need to make space for just not preserve that Cape Dutch architecture. If you go to Ghana and the slave castles, the multitude of stakeholders there having a say in how those castles are maintained is a striking example of how people wants to have space, wants to have a say. How to do it, I don't know, but I know that we, instead of saying, okay, revolutionary, now we decolonized, it's not going to work. Since 1994, there is that the diversity of the narrative that brought us the Intangible Heritage Convention. Well, in 10 years' time, the nominations in the West and listed intangible practices are again much higher than in Africa and in other parts of the world. So the intention of the Eurocentric UNESCO might be okay, but it is not okay to just say overnight, and now we decolonize. We have to go to a thorough understanding, and I can only facilitate. That's how I feel. That's what I do in my teaching. But there are a lot of other people who can take the lead in this process. I've said.
Thanks very much. Before I respond, I see Adriana and Christina have hands up and questions. If you don't mind, can we leave the questions till the end? If that's okay. Please feel free to disagree. But yeah, it's okay. All right, great, thank you. Just to briefly respond to that, that idea of shared heritage is something that that I think has been tried in a lot of places, or has been used in a lot of places. And as you pointed out, there's very often it's somebody coming with money looking to preserve their heritage in those places, and wrapping it in this idea of this is everybody's heritage. And perhaps one of the challenges for World Heritage as well, who makes those decisions about what that is. And when we talk about decolonizing heritage, is that actually something that we can do? Heritage is already decolonized. People already understand their own heritage in different ways. No matter where they are, and no matter who the management institution is, people understand their heritage the way they understand their heritage. And perhaps the decolonization discourse should be aimed more at ourselves as practitioners and archaeologists and managers, and how we step back a little and let people get more involved in deciding what those discourses are and what that heritage means. What those, in the case of World Heritage, what those universal outstanding values are. I think I'm going to hand over to Pascal Taravinga. I noticed that he may have some connection problems, so I hope that he'll be able to stay with us. So Dr. Taravinga holds a PhD in archaeology, and he's worked extensively in World Heritage, starting in Zimbabwe in 1995, and where he became the president of ICOMOS in Zimbabwe, and more recently as the Chief Heritage Officer at Robben Island World Heritage Site in South Africa. I was looking at his experience, and it spans a multitude of heritage-related issues and practices, including management, museology, archaeology, World Heritage, sustainable development, management, again, intangible heritage, tourism, community engagement and involvement, capacity building, and many others. I wanted Pascal to finish this panel because he, as Chief Heritage Officer at Robben Island, has really been involved at the World Heritage Sites and has a deep understanding of the processes that occur through the management of World Heritage Sites. My story about meeting Dr. Taravinga, I think it was in 2013. I was at the South African Heritage Resources Agency, and I wanted to speak to somebody at Robben Island to get some formal support for managing underwater cultural heritage within the 1 nautical mile buffer zone around the island. And I was running late for the meeting and rushed into his office, breathing heavily and sweating a little bit. He had other meetings, but was willing to give me a little bit of time. And I spent half an hour talking to him while he patiently sat and listened to me about what I was asking for from the island and from the museum. And when I'd done, he slid an envelope across the desk, which had a letter of support outlining everything that I'd just been saying to him. And then he apologized and that he had to go to his next meeting and sent me on my way, feeling slightly embarrassed for having wasted his time. Even so, he's continued to support a lot of work that we've done in South Africa and around Robben Island in terms of underwater cultural heritage and many other heritage projects, no matter how bizarre and strange they may be. He's always been available to entertain and listen to what we have to say. And his patience has, I think, been that of a saint. So with that, I want to hand over to him, and once he's finished, we will discuss the issues in more detail and answer the questions. So please go ahead, Pascal.
Thank you so much. And my apologies for my network. Was coming from another engagement, so I had to find the best way I can have this presentation. Thank you so much, and I would like to start by acknowledging the two professors that have spoken before me. And thank you so much for opening up this debate and also giving us a foundation. And my departure point is that when we talk about world heritage and decolonization, I think we have to be upfront that this is a conversation that needs to be depoliticized and looks at the local perspective of how heritage is identified, managed, and presented. And I think it's a point that Professor Rasool really made, and I'll come back to it and demonstrate how they've actually tried to bring into the mainstream of World Heritage Convention this thinking by partnering with Robben Island and even training students in South Africa, including the rest of Africa. To me, heritage is first and foremost a local phenomena before it becomes world heritage of outstanding universal value. While the appropriation of local values of heritage is world heritage has been popularized since 1972, the major weakness is that this concept was founded in exogenous concepts and notions that really didn't cater for how heritage is defined, identified, and described and used and managed at the local level. So this has resulted in neglecting what is considered of significance at the local levels, including emerging new heritage typologies. For example, now we are talking about sites of memory. In Africa, we are talking about modern urban heritage. I will come back to that in a minute. So what I'm trying to say is that the definition criteria that can be used to separate heritage values into outstanding, not outstanding, how to manage those sites, what they mean to varying stakeholders, can never be completely understood by only applying universal concepts such as the World Heritage Convention. I think there's need to evolve heritage approach from the context and the foundations of the society that it needs to serve. Of course, I would like to emphasize one point, which is the monumental approach of the World Heritage Convention, of course, derived from the Venice Charter and the European idea of heritage. This created little room for intangible heritage as provided by Criteria 6. And you would have seen how it's difficult for state parties dealing with intangible heritage are able to inscribe a site on the World Heritage List without using another supportive criteria. There are very few that can do that, and it's not easy to sail through that. And of course, we are now looking at new heritage typologies on the African continent. One of them is the sites of memories, including recent conflicts like what Rwanda is trying to push, the sites of genocides. And what you can see is that there's politics filtering into sites of memories, and the scientific process might actually be compromised in the process because these sites, they hold different meanings in a different context, in a different season. And these nations or state parties, they would like some of these sites inscribed as World Heritage in terms of their relevance to who they are, what they've experienced, what they've gone through as nations. Of course, another type of heritage sites that is seriously underrepresented is African traditional religions that are synonymous with Gothic churches on the list for architectural reasons. So all I'm trying to say is that in Africa, sometimes you, or in other continents, you cannot separate tangible and intangible, culture and nature. And of course, the convention has tried to cover that, but I think it's the application of the criterion that relates to that still gives problem in other continents. Of course, there's another typology, the modern urban heritage, which is linked somehow to colonial heritage and even recent heritage. So when we look at urban heritage, some communities might consider it as a foreign to them. So we need to look at the time dimensions, representation, and how this concept links to other architectural aspects of heritage in Africa. Of course, not recognizing some of these values is contributing to the underrepresentation of regions such as Africa on the World Heritage list. And then, of course, one dimension also, which is important in terms of the convention and which borders around the whole issue of decolonization, is, I think, the imbalance between experts from the West or developed countries and experts from developing nations and continents like Africa. I think UNESCO, the advisory bodies and AWHF, they're trying to address that. But the issue is that you have so many experts from the West taking missions in other continents, for example, Africa, but you hardly have experts from Africa taking missions, for instance, in Asia or the Americas. So if this is about universal heritage, I think experts have to be brought to that level where they can contribute to the whole process of world heritage, regardless of the continent and everything else. Of course, there are inroads that are being made by AWHF in trying to build capacity on the African continent. And I'm aware of a workshop that, a program that they're about to launch, where they want to induct a number of emerging African practitioners into the World Heritage Convention processes and systems and what is expected of them and so on, so that they can become part and parcel of the scientific experts inputting into this process. But of course, when you look at that also, it has given room to issues of world heritage and politics. And I think society and politics are inseparable. Where science cannot provide solutions, politics filters into the process. And even where criterion makes it difficult to inscribe particular site types, politics is crept into the decisions of the World Heritage Committee. So whether we like it or not, politics will always be there. So it's not about developed and being developed, it's part of society. The question rather is how do we broaden the World Heritage governance and these tools to be inclusive and transparent to avoid a perpetual approach of observers in the World Heritage process. Politicians represent the voices of the majority, while experts are for conservation. And I think it's a matter that needs to really be looked at from a governance perspective and say, how do we make the governance process and the decision-making processes of World Heritage inclusive, transparent, and make them sensitive to issues beyond conservation itself and the OUV. And then, of course, there's another dimension that is related to World Heritage that needs to be really looked at in a serious way, and decolonization can help in the process. Some people view World Heritage as vanity projects, desirable projects to have. It's desirable for any country to have a World Heritage site. But what is the benefit to the society? And I think that benefit should be beyond conservation value proposition that comes with the convention. And if you look at the African continent, historically, even considering pre-colonial states, they protected and utilized heritage at the same time, including other resources close to the sites. Like, for example, if you look at Mapunguko World Heritage Site, what we celebrate as state formation and outstanding universal value is got elements of extracting minerals and refining them and producing priceless artifacts and collections such as the gold rhinoceros. So what I'm trying to say is that sustainable development or development is not new. The 2015 policy, yes, it's in place, but the use of heritage for meeting the needs of society has always been an issue of concern. It's a growing concern. But what I'm asking here is there are indigenous terminologies that mean the same like sustainable development. For example, if you look in Zambia, there are agricultural systems that adopted this approach for quite a number of decades and everything else. But when you look at the 2015 World Heritage Policy, you can see that the terminology is more recent and more inclined to support what is being pushed as a balanced approach. So what I'm saying, what is it that we are localizing in terms of concept? Because if pre-colonial communities, colonial communities were already using heritage sites in a sustainable manner, so what is it that are we localizing now? Or rather, we should be looking at a way of engaging the local and the global processes to find an optimal and adaptive way of retaining the localness of heritage and its value proposition to communities, as well as meeting the objectives of the convention. And from a management perspective of World Heritage, I would like to say that while World Heritage Convention recognizes both management plans and traditional management systems, the latter remains in the shadows of the former. There's general acceptance of management plans as offering optimal strategies to the protection and management of sites that are on the World Heritage list. You look, for example, a site like Ashanti traditional building site in Ghana, which borders on architecture and traditional management systems. It has never had its formal traditional management system recorded and applied as the management system of the site. It applies to many other sites. You look at Metropolis World Heritage Site in Zimbabwe, it has got a management plan, but part of the criteria is intangible heritage. And when you look at the management plan, you can see that there's a serious bias towards this modern approach called management planning and everything else. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it's that time we elevate traditional management systems to the same level we have elevated management plans, even including developing generic guidelines that can be adapted and used by parties that are looking after sites of that nature. And related to that, I think the management of World Heritage Site cannot be de-associated with the very same communities who are the creators and protectors of this heritage. And then, of course, there's another issue that is worrisome sometimes, but of course, I think it borders on the arena's interpretation of what the convention says and how the state parties that are implementing the convention see things. There is need to look at how we can actually encourage state parties to understand that the convention does not say they don't have to manage other values at the site. What is considered as outstanding might be just one value, but there are other values that have significance to different stakeholders at the local level. And we must always understand that World Heritage is a drop into the landscape with multiple values, like at Robben Island. The triumph of women's spirit is largely connected with the political imprisonment period, but there are other layers like the banishment of traditional chiefs who were resisting the colonial occupation by the British and the Dutch. And that's very important in part in terms of the history of the struggle in South Africa. So and also there is the Second World War memory sites on the island. So what I'm trying to say is that we must not abuse the convention to abscond from taking full responsibility of the totality of the values of the sites that are part and parcel of our World Heritage List. And this includes even further developing integrated management plans. And then, of course, something that is very tricky to talk about is the language options for the World Heritage Convention and decision-making systems. We are still stuck with English, Spanish, French, and so on and so on. And there hasn't been any deliberate of adopting a common language from a continent, let's say from Africa. We choose one language that then becomes a language of option during the engagements and the discussions. Because I remember in 2011, during a conference on World Heritage and communities in South Africa, a Maasai representative from Ngorongoro Conservation Area, when he took the podium, he started speaking in Swahili, and it threw off the translators because they didn't understand Swahili. They just prepared for English and Spanish and French. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a loss, there's a risk with the World Heritage Convention that it loses relevance because of language options and how that can be addressed. I think it's a matter of discussion, and that can be looked at seriously. And while steps are being taken to decolonize World Heritage, I would like to say that there's still a lot that needs to be done. And I think from the first two speakers, there are quite a number of pillars that they've proposed that I think require a non-politicized discussion, a non-politicized strategy to say, how do we make World Heritage Convention meet its obligation, but at the same time, it's relevant to the local way it's operating in different countries. And coming back to this whole issue of World Heritage as outstanding universal value, this whole concept of shared value, and the question that I've always been asking myself is the way we are processing this shared value actually founded on the understanding and the evolving understanding of heritage in different continents. I don't think we are at that stage where we can say the criteria is providing a foolproof framework for even recognizing new heritage typologies. I think there's more work that needs to be done. There's also need to link the World Heritage process with academic institution. And I will give an example of the partnership between Robben Island and the University of Western Cape, which has actually been capacitating heritage practitioners on the continent from very different dimensions, but promoting critical thinking so that we don't follow suit and become victims of what we're doing in the past. And my question is, how many of these universities, for example, in Africa, that are actually connected with this World Heritage Convention? And how many of these academics are actually connected with the sites themselves? For example, developing a nomination file is a technical process that would actually require an input of an academic who has been doing a lot of research, because the idea that a site manager is a one-stop shop is actually wrong. We need to cross the bridge and get into the space where we work with academic institutions. These are knowledge hubs, these are knowledge producers, and the quality control processes, and that will help produce credible documents and even begin to test the theory and practice. Like, for example, this initiative that is coming from ICROM, the Heritage Lab Practice, where they are trying to connect a university and a World Heritage site and look at the research, what can be done jointly by the two institutions, and how that is going to help in the process of decolonizing the implementation of World Heritage in Africa. Having said that, I'd like to stop at this point and say we still have a lot of work to do to try and make sure that the World Heritage Convention is relevant to the way heritage is seen at the local levels in the countries where it's, and the continents where it is presented. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to get that kind of insight from somebody who's worked so deeply in a World Heritage site. I came back to this idea of experts and who they are and who decides who they are. And while I think there is an understanding that there is expertise that is required in conservation and various other quite technical matters in terms of who decides what the heritage is and how that's managed, perhaps there is more that we could look at there. It's disheartening to hear that traditional management plans and traditional management systems are kind of in the background, in the shadow of the management systems that are recognized by institutions like UNESCO and other management institutions globally. I was also struck by what you're saying with the role of academia and how academia can contribute to these discussions and the way that we see World Heritage sites, and if that is something that we need to look at more closely and that we need to expand. I think at this point, let me open up the floor to everybody. I think Adriana's hand up was, or had her hand up first. I don't know if you are able to say anything, or if you have to put your questions in the chat. Perhaps the technical people can advise me on that.
Oh, Jonathan, she can put the question in the chat. She cannot open the microphone as an attendee, okay?
Great, thanks. If you don't mind doing that, Adriana. In the meantime, Christina asked, is the involvement of European museums in repatriation efforts not a way to still remain in charge of the World Heritage debate, but now free from guilt or ethical issues? I will open that up to all of you.
Thank you, Jonathan, Christina, other colleagues, for very important questions and comments. I thought I would begin by just addressing some of the disciplinary issues that Jonathan raised, particularly around archaeology and the difficulties of archaeology. As someone who began thinking about this issue when, as a SARA counselor, one of the things that you have to that you are responsible for is the management of archaeological permits, and where you're able to, in a sense, analyze the health or the lack of health of an entire discipline and how it is socially organized and carved up into these different forms of practice. And how little, for a long time, archaeology transformed itself, and what the difficulties were of archaeology in South Africa, and why it was that, unlike in Zimbabwe, archaeology was not valued as a discipline of the new nation. You had a few examples of archaeology and related disciplines, bioanthropology and so forth, expressing its value through Mapungubwe, through the, in a sense, the Zimbabweanization of a kind of site. And I think what's quite interesting also is how archaeology has held onto a kind of, the characteristics of the colonial fossil complex in its kind of liberal forms in South Africa, with science presenting itself as caring for indigenous pasts, but where, quite frankly, the descendants of the people whose pasts were being studied were completely depoliticized. I think that's changing slightly. This problem of the reproduction of these colonial ideas are particularly evident, with paleoanthropology and the way in which the democratic state has simply reproduced the fossil complex and these kinds of ideas without paying attention to the atrocities surrounding this, where the founders of these disciplines, Dart, Broom, etc., were equally involved in the defilement of human bodies from their graves, boiling flesh off bone at the same time as they were excavating fossils, because they had identified this notion of the living fossil. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in rethinking disciplines. Universities such as mine, for example, historically Black universities, not allowed to have archaeology as a discipline because archaeology was seen as a white discipline. You had a little bit of archaeology as a branch of Pretoria at what was then called the University of Venda. That was because of the presence of Mapungubwe. It's very different in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has produced many archaeologists who have, exported to South Africa, exported to other parts of the world, and that's a very, very interesting model of how archaeology has been able to make a claim to the post-colonial nation. But to come to specifically underwater archaeology, I think that has been very interesting, particularly the work that you and other colleagues such as Heather Wares, who's also with us today, did in your work with Diving for a Purpose. Realizing the work that Diving with a Purpose did in the United States, in the excavation of Clotilde and the last ships with enslaved people that entered the rivers of these landscapes of enslavement, and how that work has tied into a demand in the United States for taking the history of slavery and enslavement much more seriously, of looking at the genealogies of violence that begin in enslavement and that culminate in mass incarceration, and that include state terror of African American people that we know about from the struggles of #Black Lives Matter and the experience of the murder of George Floyd and that kind of politics. And so there are new institutions in the United States that demand these to be at the forefront of understanding the United States. So it is possible. It is possible to rethink disciplines outside of the ways they were configured so that you don't have to rely on scientization, on the claims of science and scientific capacity to be able to move into the future. These were the problems at Prestwich Place. These were the big struggles over heritage in South Africa. And Christine is, of course, absolutely right that one of the dangers that we have, you know, in the aftermath of the Savoy report to Macron, with the moves made in Germany, particularly around Benin bronzes, the moves by the Preußische Kulturbesitz, the developments in a few of the main ethnographic museums, to embrace the possibility of restitution, to engage with restitution as being a new kind of a race to colonization, a race to cleaning themselves up, and it's something that one really needs to keep one's eye on. But in response to that, it is very clear that restitution is not a set of events. That, I mean, of course, European governments want it to be like that, so that they can quickly clean their hands and hand over dilemmas to African societies. But restitution is such a complex field that is now being opened up. We are needing to understand its history and the history of claims making. But we need to be building African claims. We need to be resourcing institutions of civil society that are pushing, that are driving these debates, as at the same time we have to enable this to be brought increasingly onto the agenda of the African Union. South Africa, unfortunately, is not, despite any attempt to lobby the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture around these matters, it hasn't accepted what the enormous possibilities that can come from that. And for South Africa, of course, it's restitution both ways, because South Africa was the former colonial power over Namibia and the regional power over other Southern African nations. And so the restitution can open up a new field of enablement, a new field of reclaiming personhood, of rethinking humanity. And museums are far more important for us. And as we do so, we rethink what it means, what we mean by museum.
Can I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Maybe we need another moment of silence here, because Shiraz has such a strong message. A lot to think about. And again, let me put myself into the European context. How hard I try to be not in the European context. I see that happening from the European context, that whitewashing of their past, the colonial past, by accepting it and giving back collections. And I think I'm not interested in the thing anymore. I'm not interested in the tangible side of those links anymore. I'm completely interested in the narrative. And if you look what is happening and the way Shiraz describes it, that's exactly what they do. The question about the moral ownership that they put on those collections. A very good example I felt them. I remember when those destruction took place in Syria and in Iraq, they posted an Iraqi guy in the British Museum who was reunited with some of those things that were destroyed under ISIS and under the conflict in the Middle East. And they really posted it like, you see, this at least we have this still in the British Museum. And I brought that to my class to discuss this, whether that is a valid argument that is put forward by people like Kuno and then a Syrian student of mine said, well, it's interesting that you put up this tweet, because I have the same photograph, but it is actually the reopening of the Iraq Museum showing the items that they saved. So you see that the narrative around those things, the narrative around what it means and who has the moral ownership. You know, the whole Egyptian history is claimed by Europe because nobody in Egypt was interested in their history. If they didn't have digged up, if they didn't understood the hieroglyphs, then that whole history would have been lost. So I think for me, and that plays out on the World Heritage with the outstanding and universal values that Pascal brought forward, but also in this type of what the role of museums is. And I fully agree that the role of museums is so important because they are much more flexible moving forwards into the future than the concept of World Heritage sites, where the outstanding and universal values, the narrative of why it's so important, are often cast in concrete. Working with Veronica Pereira, one of our colleagues, works on Ilha Mozambique. They struggle, the community struggle there with that. Their outstanding universal value is that they are a Portuguese trade post in between Europe and Asia. You know, how to get rid of that outstanding and universal value if there's so many more layers. And that is what we try to do with our research group, the concept of heritage labs, in which we try to bring all those layers of narratives, give it a place, not trying to fight the system, because we can't, and that would be you know, that it would be a waste of our time. What we try to do is bringing that narrative, whether it is the narrative connected to museum collections, whether they stay in Europe or be brought back. The narrative should be told, the understanding of who put the moral claim on those objects and who has other claims on those objects. And the same counts for the World Heritage, you know, by opening up a platform for stakeholders, even if you're a stakeholder far, far, far away. The castles in Ghana are a good example. The African Americans in America feel really strong stakeholders of those sites. But even to go to less popular examples, if you look at fascistic architecture in Africa under the Italian colonizers, you know, there are groups in Italy saying this is very important architecture. They stakeholders too. So for me, our task would be to understand that process of how we create heritage in the present and how we create heritage for the future. And understanding that process is by recording it, giving space to all those stakeholders to put that narrative. And for me, narrative is central, whether it is a museum collection or a World Heritage site.
Just to add on a little bit, I think the whole issue around the role of European museums in repatriation efforts and the post-preservationist approaches that Professor Siraj talked about. I think, firstly, repatriation is a museological transaction between two museums or two institutions. And I think there has been too much politicization of that process. And also the overemphasis that the destination museums, which are receiving back their collections, they are not fully capacitated, they don't have resources, and therefore they still need to be supported. But of course, that's a narrative. But from where I'm sitting, I think that museological transaction has to be informed by new thinking by the receiving museums. Because once we allow it to go the way it's going, we are going to go back into the preservationist model, where we are supposed to receive these things, put them in some archive or a collections facility, and you lock them up, and that's it. And in some cases, some of these objects that are being repatriated, they no longer have the same meaning, and they no longer have a role to play in the intangible and contemporary practices of the nations where they're going. For example, now the issue around the masks. In some other countries, they're no longer using those masks. They've turned to plastic masks. And so what I'm trying to say is that heritage is not static. and it's the destination that is receiving the repatriated object that has to define what needs to happen. And I think the transaction must just end in them handing over and not prescribing how the collections must be looked after or how the collections must be used, because that's a local issue to say, guys, we have these collections now. What do we do from there?
I'm not sure if we've lost Pascal. Thank you all for those answers. And I think it probably is at the heart of this question of decolonization and what that actually means. That, as you all already pointed out, that we have this idea that decolonization of heritage is this process that we understand and that we follow, and in 10 years' time we'll know what we've got. But in actual fact, it's not that. It is a much more dynamic process, and it is a process that people have to understand from their own perspective. This is not something that we can dictate to people. For me, it raises a lot of questions about potentially we can't change the World Heritage Convention, but maybe we need to rethink the purpose of World Heritage. What does it mean in that conservationist approach that Pascal was talking about? Is that still the direction that we should be taking? Is preserving those monuments to whatever they are really the World Heritage, or is it those values that go around with it? Is that intangible stuff? Is it the understanding of heritage and the narratives that Robert mentioned? Is that really what sits at the core of this? I'm cognizant of the time and that we need to wrap up. I don't see any more questions from the attendees. I don't know if anybody from the rest of the panel has any questions. I saw that Monica had a question, but that it may already have been answered. But is there anything else you'd like to ask or add to that?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that my question was already answered by the panelists, and I would like very, very much to thank them for this incredible set of insights and inputs that they provide us. It was a very, very interesting session, and I thank them very, very much.
Thanks, and I would echo that. Thank you all for your input. For me, this has been one of the few discussions where anybody has spoken about the substance of decolonization rather than the idea of what it is and why it's not working, or what the implications of decolonization or non-decolonization is. So I really would like to thank you for those insights. I'd like to thank the attendees for your time as well. And if you don't mind me just giving a little plug to the next session, which I think starts in an hour, the heritage of the marginalized, on the same platform. Please have a look at that and join us later for that conversation. So thank you again, and I hope that this conversation goes forward in a positive way and in a way that you've opened up today.
Thank you so much. Muy obrigado. Bom dia.
Thank you so much. Thank you.